The murderer was the first to call the police. A Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. The Guns of Ashcombe Priory. The autumn light over Ashcombe Priory had the peculiar quality of pewter, bright enough to gild the tops of the elms along the drive, yet somehow without warmth, as though the sun itself had decided to attend the weekend's shooting party only as an observer and not a participant. Captain Arthur Hastings, arriving by the 4 o'clock train and collected at the station by a taciturn chauffeur named Gill, thought the house looked precisely like the sort of place where nothing untoward could ever happen. He was, as it transpired, spectacularly wrong. Ashcombe Priory belonged to Sir Marcus Vane, a shipping magnate whose fortune had been built, brick by brick and hull by hull, from a single tramp steamer his father had owned on the Thames. Sir Marcus was 61, thick about the neck, given to sudden barks of laughter that silenced rooms, and possessed of the particular arrogance of a man who has never once in his life been told no and meant it. He stood now in the great hall, greeting his guests with a hand outstretched and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Hastings, splendid. And you've brought your friend, the Belgian fellow. Poirot, isn't it?" Sir Marcus's grip was crushing. "I've heard of you, monsieur. The little detective chap. Well, you'll find nothing to detect here except who can hit a pheasant on the wing and who can't." Hercule Poirot, immaculate in a grey travelling suit that had survived the train journey without acquiring so much as a speck of soot, bowed with the precision of a man who had rehearsed the gesture in a mirror. "I am here, Sir Marcus, entirely as Hastings's guest, and I assure you my only ambition this weekend is to eat well and sleep better. I have no interest whatsoever in your pheasants, nor, I confess, in your guns." A man ought to have some interest in guns. It was, Hastings reflected later, a remark of unwitting prophecy. The house party, as Hastings came to understand it over sherry that evening, was not so much a gathering of friends as a convocation of obligations. There was Lady Diana Vane, Sir Marcus's wife, some 15 years his junior, whose beauty had the brittle, polished quality of a woman who had learned long ago to arrange her face into pleasantness regardless of what she felt beneath it. There was Evangeline Vane, the daughter of Sir Marcus's first marriage, 24 and restless, who spent the sherry hour glancing repeatedly at the door as though expecting, or dreading, someone's arrival. There was Simon Traherne, Sir Marcus's nephew and junior partner in the shipping firm of Vane and Traherne, a lean young man with quick, watchful eyes and a laugh that came a half-second too late to every joke, as if he were translating humour from some private language. There was Colonel Rupert Ashworth, an old friend of Sir Marcus's from his army days, whose florid complexion and unsteady hand about the decanter suggested a man for whom the evening's first drink was rarely the day's first. There was Dr. Edmund Rossiter, the family physician, and a guest of some 30 years' standing, quiet, grey, and possessed of the watchful stillness of a man accustomed to keeping other people's secrets. And there was Miss Prudence Hart, Sir Marcus's secretary, a woman of perhaps 40, whose plain dress and self-effacing manner could not entirely disguise a certain sharpness in her gaze whenever it rested, as it did, more than once, upon her employer. "A curious assembly," Poirot murmured to Hastings as they dressed for dinner. "Observe, my friend, how each person in that hall wears politeness as one wears a coat against the rain, necessary, but not comfortable, and easily removed. You think there's something wrong here? I think, Hastings, that there is a great deal of money in this house, and where there is a great deal of money, there is very often a great deal of unhappiness pretending to be otherwise." Poirot straightened his moustache in the glass with evident satisfaction. "But let us not borrow trouble. We are here for the shooting. Or rather, you are here for the shooting, and I am here for Mrs. Gill's cooking, which Sir Marcus assures me is exceptional." Dinner was, indeed, exceptional, though the conversation around the table was not. Sir Marcus dominated it entirely, recounting at length a dispute with a rival shipping line over cargo insurance, needling Simon Traherne twice about "figures that don't add themselves up, eh, my boy?" in a tone that might have been jest and might equally have been threat. Simon's smile, Hastings noticed, did not waver, but his knuckles whitened against the stem of his wineglass. Later, when the ladies withdrew, Sir Marcus grew expansive over port, boasting of a new will he had had drawn up that very week. Keeps everyone on their toes, don't you find, gentlemen, to remind them they might yet be disappointed. And Hastings saw Colonel Ashworth's face darken like a barometer before a storm. It was past 11 when the party broke up. Poirot, on his way to bed, paused at the head of the great staircase and looked down into the hall, where a single lamp still burned outside the door of Sir Marcus's study, a room the master of the house called, with the sort of joke that is not really a joke, my counting house. Through the door came the low murmur of voices, Sir Marcus's and another's, pitched too low for the words to carry. "Someone is arguing with our host," Poirot observed. "None of our business," said Hastings, stifling a yawn. "No," Poirot agreed slowly, his dark eyes still fixed on that thread of lamplight beneath the study door. "Not yet." He lingered a moment longer upon the landing, and Hastings, out of curiosity more than suspicion, lingered with him. The voices below fell silent. A chair scraped upon the parquet, and then the study door opened just far enough to let a single figure slip out into the hall. Simon Traherne, moving with the quick, contained step of a man, anxious not to be observed leaving. He did not glance up toward the staircase, and after a moment he crossed to the morning room and passed out of sight. "Curious," Poirot murmured, "that a discussion of accounts should end so abruptly, and with such evident reluctance on the part of one participant to be seen departing it. Perhaps he simply didn't fancy being caught out of bed at that hour." "Perhaps," said Poirot, in the tone of a man who did not believe it for a moment, and at last permitted Hastings to lead him off to bed. Chapter 2. A Shot Before Dawn. Hastings would remember afterward that he had been dreaming of nothing more sinister than a badly organized cricket match when the sound tore through it. A single sharp crack, flat and final, followed by a silence so complete that for a moment he wondered if he had dreamed the noise as well as the cricket. Then came the scream. He was out of bed and into his dressing gown before he had fully woken, colliding with Poirot in the corridor, who was already dressed to the extent of trousers and a silk robe thrown hastily over his nightshirt, his hair, for once imperfect. "That was a shot," said Poirot, his voice clipped of all its usual ornament. They were not the first to arrive at the study door. Miss Prudence's heart stood frozen upon the threshold, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other gripping the door frame as though it alone kept her upright. Beyond her, in the lamplight, Sir Marcus Vane lay sprawled across the leather-topped desk that had been the seat of his empire, a small dark stain spreading beneath his temple onto the blotting paper. His own revolver, a Webley, Hastings noted automatically, the sort a man might keep for guarding cash boxes rather than for sport, lying some 18 inches from his outflung right hand. "Nobody is to touch anything," said Poirot, and there was such authority in it that even Colonel Ashworth, arriving at a run in a nightshirt that did nothing for his dignity, stopped dead in the doorway. It was Simon Traherne who took command of what followed. Simon, fully dressed despite the hour, his hair damp as though freshly combed, his voice steady in a way that struck Hastings, even in the chaos of the moment, as faintly remarkable. "I'll telephone the police," he said, and was gone down the passage to the instrument in the morning room before anyone else had gathered their wits sufficiently to suggest it. Lady Diana Vane appeared next, in a wrap of dark blue silk, and stood very still in the doorway looking down at her husband's body with an expression Hastings could not read. Not grief, precisely, nor yet triumph, but something suspended between the two, as though she were waiting to discover which she ought to feel. Evangeline Vane came behind her mother, stepmother, Hastings corrected himself, and did not look at the body at all, but at Simon Traherne's retreating back, with an expression of naked terror that vanished the instant she realized she was observed. Dr. Rossiter knelt by the body with the economical calm of long professional habit. though even he, Hastings thought, was paler than the lamplight alone could account for. "He's been dead perhaps 20 minutes, the doctor said quietly, straightening. "No more than that. The wound is to the right temple, consistent with the pistol found there." "Consistent with suicide," said Colonel Ashworth too quickly. "Or an accident. The man was forever cleaning that wretched gun himself. Never trusted a servant with it." "Colonel," said Poirot, very gently, "no one has yet suggested it was anything else." But something in the way he said it, the faint, deliberate weight he laid upon the word yet, made Hastings glance sharply at his friend, and made, he thought, Colonel Ashworth's ruddy face go a shade paler still. From the passage came the sound of Simon Treherne's voice, still on the telephone. "Yes, I found him myself, not 5 minutes ago. No, I heard the shot and came directly. Yes, I'll wait for you here." Poirot had moved, without seeming to move at all, to a position from which he could see both the body and the study clock upon the mantel, an ornate brass affair, still ticking undisturbed, its hands standing at 17 minutes past 5. "Miss Hart," he said, turning to the secretary, who had not yet found her voice, "you were the first to reach this room. Can you tell me, when precisely did you hear the shot?" She swallowed. I couldn't say exactly. I was asleep. It woke me, and I came at once. But I hardly know how long that took me. A minute, perhaps 2. And Monsieur Treherne, was he already here when you arrived?" "No." Miss Hart's eyes flickered, just once, toward the empty doorway through which Simon had gone. "No, he came just after me, perhaps 30 seconds after." Poirot said nothing further for the moment, but Hastings, watching him, saw his friend's gaze travel once more to the clock on the mantel, and then to the study window, whose curtains, though the room was on the ground floor, and the gardens beyond, lay wreathed in the last darkness before dawn, stood very slightly, very deliberately, ajar. "The window," Poirot murmured, so low that only Hastings caught it. "Now that, mon ami, is interesting. A cold night, and a man does not often work with his window open, unless, of course, he wished someone to believe he had stepped out through it, or unless someone else wished us to believe so." Somewhere down the passage, the telephone receiver was replaced with a soft, final click, and Simon Treherne's footsteps came back toward the study, unhurried, Hastings noticed, for a man who had just discovered his uncle murdered. Chapter 3. The Man on the Telephone. Inspector Japp, for it was, by extraordinary coincidence of the sort that delighted Poirot and mildly embarrassed Hastings, none other than that solid and dependable officer of Scotland Yard, who had been staying with the local chief constable for a fishing holiday, not 4 miles distant, arrived within the hour, brisk, damp mackintoshed, and entirely unsurprised to find Hercule Poirot already established at the scene. "Well, well," said Japp, surveying the study with the weary satisfaction of a man for whom murder was simply an especially tiresome species of paperwork. "Trust you to be holidaying in the one house in Kent where a millionaire gets himself shot. Right, let's have it from the top. Who found him?" "I did," said Simon Treherne. He had recovered his composure entirely by now, and delivered his account with the smooth, practiced clarity of a man reciting a well-rehearsed speech, which struck Hastings uncomfortably as precisely what it might have been. "I couldn't sleep. I came down to fetch a book from the library, and as I passed the study I heard the shot, quite unmistakable, and went in at once. I found my uncle exactly as you see him. I telephoned the police immediately." "Immediately," Japp repeated, making a note. "And what time would that have been, sir?" "I couldn't say to the minute. Perhaps 20 past 5. "The study clock," Poirot put in mildly, "showed 17 minutes past 5 when I myself entered the room, some 3 or 4 minutes, I should judge, after the alarm was first raised." Japp glanced at the mantel clock, then at his own watch, then made another note. "We'll want the exchange records for that call. These country lines log the time automatically nowadays. Modern miracle, that." He turned back to Simon. "You say you heard the shot from the passage. Where were you coming from?" Precisely. My room, upstairs, dressed, at that hour. For the first time, something flickered behind Simon Treherne's watchful eyes, there and gone so swiftly that Hastings could not afterward have sworn to it. I hadn't yet gone to bed. I'd been going over some papers, business matters. My uncle and I had words, earlier in the evening, about the firm's accounts, and I found I couldn't settle. Words, said Japp. What sort of words? The ordinary sort between a man and his junior partner. Nothing that signifies. Poirot, who had been examining the desk with minute attention, the blotting paper, the disordered stack of ledgers, a brass paper knife lying askew beside an ashtray containing a single crushed cigarette, looked up at this. And yet, Monsieur Treherne, it is my understanding that you and your uncle were overheard in this very room, past 11 o'clock last night, in conversation that Miss Hart's account suggests was rather more than merely words between a man and his junior partner. Simon's composure did not crack, precisely, but it thinned, like ice under a slowly increasing weight. My uncle was displeased with certain figures in the last quarter's accounts. I explained the discrepancy. He was satisfied. That is all there was to it. Ah, said Poirot, and smiled, and let the matter drop with a suddenness that Hastings recognized, though Simon Treherne perhaps did not, as the very opposite of dismissal. Japp, meanwhile, had turned his attention to the practicalities of the scene, directing his young constable to photograph the body from several angles before the police surgeon's men were permitted to move it, and dispatching Gill the chauffeur, still in his nightshirt and a borrowed overcoat, to fetch the local doctor's bag from the surgery in the village, Dr. Rossiter's own case having proved short of certain instruments the surgeon required. It was, Hastings reflected, a curiously ordinary business, this business of murder, a matter of photographs and fetched bags and constables making chalk marks, for all the horror that lay at its centre, and he found himself grateful for Poirot's calm, methodical presence amid it, a small island of order in a house suddenly and thoroughly disordered. You will want to see the household assembled properly, once the worst of this is dealt with, Poirot murmured to Japp, drawing him a little aside from the others. I would suggest the library, Inspector, rather than this room, which I think we should preserve exactly as it stands for some hours yet. And I would suggest, further, that you allow me to observe the interviews you conduct this morning, for a man's manner, under the shock of sudden questioning, often tells us a great deal more than the careful answers he gives once he has had time to compose himself. You always did have a taste for watching a man squirm, Poirot, said Japp, not unkindly. Very well, but I'll do the asking. This is still a police matter, whatever holiday cottage I happen to be staying in this week. Naturally, mon ami, I would not dream of usurping your authority. I wish only to watch, and to think, and, if you will permit it, to ask perhaps one question of my own at the end of each. Japp moved the interview along, taking each member of the household in turn, while the police surgeon completed his examination of the body, and a young constable made chalk marks upon the floor. Lady Diana Vane, when questioned, said only that she had been asleep, that she had heard nothing until the scream, and that her marriage, though the inspector had not asked, had been a partnership of convenience, Inspector, as I imagine you have already gathered, and I see no reason to pretend otherwise to a policeman investigating a murder. Evangeline Vane wept prettily and said very little of substance. Colonel Ashworth blustered about suicide and accident with a persistence that struck Hastings as protesting rather too much. Dr. Rossiter confirmed the time of death as consistent with a shot fired between 5 and 5:30, and volunteered nothing further. Miss Hart repeated her earlier account without alteration. It was Poirot who, as the grey light of true dawn began to seep through the study's ajar window, asked the question that made Inspector Japp look up sharply from his notebook. Tell me, Inspector, when the exchange records arrive, I should be most interested to know not merely when the call was placed, but its exact duration, to the second, if such precision is possible. For it seems to me, he continued, turning his gaze thoughtfully upon the still, watchful figure of Simon Treherne, that a man who telephones the police to report a murder, he has that instant discovered, speaks, as a rule, in the disordered sentences of shock, false starts, repetitions, the stumbling economy of panic. Whereas the gentleman I overheard from this passage not 20 minutes ago spoke, from the very first word, in sentences of the most perfect and complete construction. That, mon ami, is either a man of extraordinary self-command in the face of horror, or a man who had rehearsed, in his mind, precisely what he intended to say. Chapter 4. Little Grey Cells at Breakfast. Breakfast at Ashcombe Priory, the following morning, was a subdued affair, conducted under the disapproving eye of a police constable stationed in the hall, and eaten, for the most part, in silence, broken only by the scrape of cutlery and the occasional, over-loud remark about the weather. Poirot, however, ate with his customary appetite, and appeared, to Hastings's private irritation, in excellent spirits. "You seem remarkably cheerful," Hastings observed, "for a man breakfasting in a house where murder was done not 4 hours ago." "I am not cheerful, my friend. I am interested, which is a very different thing, and considerably more useful to the dead man than gloom would be." Poirot buttered his toast with precision. "Consider what we know. Sir Marcus Vane is shot, once, in the right temple, at some time close to 5 o'clock this morning. The pistol found beside him is his own, and lay some 18 inches from his hand. Too far, I think, for a man to have dropped it there in the act of shooting himself, though not so far as to be impossible, if one wishes to argue for suicide, which I do not think anyone in this house sincerely believes. Why not suicide? Ashworth seemed keen enough on the idea. Colonel Ashworth is keen on the idea because Colonel Ashworth owes Sir Marcus Vane a sum of money he cannot repay, and a verdict of suicide closes the file rather more comfortably for him than a verdict of murder, which invites the police to ask why the guests of the house had motive to wish their host dead. Poirot held up a finger. "But consider the window, Hastings. Ajar, on a cold October night, in a room where the fire had burned down to embers by 5 in the morning. Why? To make it look as though someone came in from outside. Precisely. Or to make it look as though someone left that way, having first shot Sir Marcus at close range, and then wished to suggest an intruder. But observe further, there was no disturbance to the flower bed beneath that window, no mark upon the sill, no leaf out of place in the ivy that grows there. A person climbing in or out of that window in the dark would surely have left some trace. I think, mon ami, the window was opened after the shot was fired, and by someone already inside the room, opened for effect, as a stage manager arranges a prop, rather than used as a genuine means of entry or escape." Hastings considered this. Then whoever shot him was already in the house, one of the guests, or one of the household. Let us not forget the servants merely because they are less picturesque than the guests. Poirot's eyes, however, did not suggest that he suspected the servants. "But there is a second matter that troubles me a great deal more than the window, and it is this, the telephone call. Treherne's call to the police. Just so. Consider the timing, Hastings. Miss Hart tells us she woke at the sound of the shot and reached the study within a minute or two. She tells us further that Monsieur Treherne arrived some 30 seconds after herself, which places him at the study door perhaps 90 seconds, at the outside, after the shot was fired. And yet he tells Inspector Japp that he was in the passage on his way to the library for a book when he heard the shot, a passage that lies, if my sense of this house's geography serves me, a full minute's brisk walk from the guest bedrooms upstairs, and rather closer to the study itself. If he had truly been coming from his bedroom, as he first implied, he could not have reached the study so quickly. But if he had already been on the ground floor, in the library, say, or in the passage outside the study itself, matters become considerably more interesting. You think he was already down there, waiting? I think, Hastings, that a man who is fully dressed at 5 o'clock in the morning, who reaches a murder scene within 90 seconds of the shot, despite claiming to have come from his bedroom, and who then telephones the police in sentences of perfect, rehearsed composure, is a man about whom I should like to know a very great deal more. Poirot poured himself a second cup of coffee with evident relish. And there is one thing further, mon ami, which I confess intrigues me above all else. A small thing, perhaps nothing at all, but the little grey cells do not like to be told a thing is nothing until they have examined it themselves. What's that? The cigarette in the ashtray. Sir Marcus, I am reliably informed by Miss Hart, smoked cigars exclusively and loathed cigarettes in his study, considering the smell offensive to his ledgers. And yet in that ashtray, this morning, lay a single cigarette, smoked almost to the end, and crushed out with some violence, as a man crushes out a cigarette when his hand is not quite steady. Poirot smiled, a small, private smile. Someone was in that room for some time before the shot was fired, Hastings, long enough to smoke a cigarette down to its end, and that someone was nervous. Chapter 5. The Room That Told a Story. Inspector Japp, to his credit, did not object when Poirot asked leave to examine the study once more, before the police photographer's plates were developed, and the room restored to whatever passed, in a house so newly bereaved, for order. "Have your look, then," Japp said. Around a briar pipe he was not, strictly speaking, permitted to smoke at a scene of violent death. "Can't say I've found much myself beyond the gun and the window, and the gun tells us nothing we didn't know. Sir Marcus's own weapon, kept in the top drawer of that desk, one round fired, his fingerprints upon it, and no one else's, which is precisely what you'd expect, whether the man shot himself or someone else did the shooting, and had the sense to press his hand round the grip afterward." Poirot moved about the room with the light, unhurried step of a man examining a garden for interesting insects rather than a chamber in which murder had been done. He knelt by the desk and studied the angle at which the body had lain, chalked now upon the carpet in the constable's careful outline. He examined the ledgers stacked upon the blotting paper, several pages of which, Hastings noted, bore figures underlined twice in red ink, a habit, Miss Hart had mentioned in passing, that Sir Marcus reserved for entries he considered irregular. He opened, with Japp's grudging permission, the drawer from which the revolver had been taken, and found within it a box of cartridges, a leather notebook secured with a small brass clasp, and, tucked beneath a stack of business correspondence, a single sheet of hotel notepaper, folded twice, bearing an address in Brighton, and, in a hand Poirot did not recognize, the single line, "You promised it would end by Michaelmas." "It has not ended. Said Poirot softly, and set the paper aside with the particular care of a man who has found something of value. Evangeline, perhaps, though her name would scarcely require initialing, in her own father's private drawer, or another E entirely. We shall see. He turned next to the window, spending a full 5 minutes upon the sill and the ivy beyond it, with a small magnifying lens, produced from his waistcoat pocket, while Japp shifted from foot to foot, with the patience of a man who has learned, over many years, that Poirot's apparent dawdling generally purchases results a plodding search would miss entirely. "No mark," Poirot pronounced at last. "No thread of cloth caught upon the ivy, no crushed stem in the bed below, no print of shoe or hand upon the sill's dust, which, you will observe, Inspector, has not been disturbed in one single particular, save where I myself have now touched it. No one entered or left by this window last night. It was opened afterward, by a hand already within this room, to suggest a story that did not happen. Whose hand? Ah, that is the question, is it not?" Poirot straightened, dusting his fingers with a small lace handkerchief, produced for the purpose. "But consider this also, mon ami, mon cher inspecteur. The fire. It had burned down to embers by 5 o'clock, Dr. Rossiter tells us, which is not remarkable in itself upon an October night, except that the coal scuttle beside the hearth is entirely full, and the poker lies across the fire irons at an angle that suggests it has not been used since it was last cleaned by a housemaid, and yet the ash within the grate is disturbed, stirred, as though someone knelt before it and searched among the embers for something already burned. Someone destroyed a paper in that fire before the shot was ever fired, Inspector, and did so with such care that they stirred the ashes afterward to be certain nothing of it remained legible. Japp peered into the grate, then at Poirot, with the expression of a man recalculating an arithmetic problem he had believed solved. You think there's a connection between whatever got burned and whatever's in that letter you just found? I think, Inspector, that Sir Marcus Vane kept in that drawer a letter which troubled someone very much indeed, troubled them enough to search, in the small hours of the morning, for something to burn in its place, or perhaps for a copy of it, or perhaps for something else entirely that we have not yet identified. And I think that whoever burned that paper was in this room a considerable time before 5 o'clock, long enough perhaps to smoke a cigarette down to its very end, while working up the courage for what came after. Chapter 6. Interviews before luncheon. Poirot conducted his own interviews that morning in the small morning room, a chamber of chintz and watercolours, quite unlike the sombre masculinity of the study, and one in which, Hastings suspected, his friend hoped the household might speak more freely than they had to the official gravity of Inspector Japp's notebook. Miss Prudence Hart came first, composed now, though her hands, folded in her lap, betrayed a faint and constant tremor. You have worked for Sir Marcus, how long, mademoiselle? 11 years, Monsieur Poirot, and in that time, I imagine, you have come to know his business very thoroughly, perhaps as thoroughly as he knew it himself. Something flickered behind her eyes. I know the accounts, if that is what you mean. I mean precisely that. Tell me, has anything in those accounts troubled you of late? A discrepancy, perhaps, in the figures of the last quarter. Miss Hart's hands stilled entirely. I am not certain what you mean, Monsieur Poirot. I mean, said Poirot, with great gentleness, that Sir Marcus was overheard, past 11 o'clock last night, in dispute with his nephew, concerning figures that did not add themselves correctly, and that this morning I find, in the study grate, the ashes of a paper deliberately destroyed. If you know anything of irregularities in the firm's ledgers, mademoiselle, I should be very glad to hear it, and I promise you it is a great deal safer to tell me now than to have Inspector Japp discover it for himself and wonder, quite reasonably, why you did not speak of it sooner. The secretary was silent a long moment. There has been money missing from the shipping accounts, she said at last, very low, for the better part of a year, small sums at first, the kind that might be explained by an error in the books. But they grew. By this summer it was several £1,000s, and Sir Marcus had begun, these last weeks, to suspect the truth of it. And the truth was, I do not know for certain, Monsieur Poirot, but I know that Mr. Traherne has sole authority over the firm's dealings with 3 of its shipping agents in Rotterdam and Antwerp, and that Sir Marcus asked me, not 10 days ago, to prepare a full audit of those 3 accounts, without Mr. Traherne's knowledge. I believe he intended to confront his nephew with the results this very weekend. Hastings, listening, felt the hairs rise upon his neck. Poirot, however, betrayed nothing beyond a small, satisfied nod, as a man might nod over a chess move he had anticipated some moves before. Thank you, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful. One further question. The letter I found in Sir Marcus's desk, signed only with the initial E, referring to a promise that should have ended by Michaelmas. Do you know anything of it? Miss Hart's composure, so carefully rebuilt, cracked all at once. I cannot say, Monsieur Poirot. I beg you not to ask me that. I shall not press you this morning, said Poirot, watching her closely. But I think, mademoiselle, that you know a great deal more of this house's secrets than you have yet told, and I think also that you are protecting someone. I would ask you only to consider, before you decide finally to remain silent, whether the person you are protecting deserves it. She left the room without answering, and did not, Hastings noticed, look at either of them again. A woman in a very great deal of distress, Hastings observed, once the door had closed behind her. A woman in a very great deal of loyalty, mon ami, which is not always so very different a thing, though it is a good deal more admirable. Poirot rose and crossed to the window, looking out over the grey lawns where a solitary gardener raked leaves with the unhurried indifference of a man to whom murder in the great house was, after all, no concern of his own. Miss Hart has served this family for 11 years, and I think she has watched, in that time, a great deal more than her employer ever suspected she watched. She knows something of the letter signed E. I am certain of it, though she will not yet say what. And she has told us, without perhaps fully understanding the weight of what she told us, that Sir Marcus intended this very morning to confront his nephew with proof of theft, and to go, this week, to the police himself. That is a motive of the most compelling kind, Hastings. Not merely money withheld, but ruin and disgrace, and very possibly a prison cell, all descending upon a single head within the space of a single week. You think it's Traherne, then? Definitely. I think, mon ami, that the little grey cells grow suspicious very quickly of a man who arrives at a murder scene within 90 seconds, dressed and composed, and telephones the police in sentences of perfect construction. But suspicion is not proof, and I have not yet finished gathering what I need. Come, I think it is time we spoke with Lady Diana. Chapter 7. The Lady in Black. Lady Diana Vane received Poirot's summons to the morning room with the air of a woman attending a mildly tiresome social obligation rather than a murder inquiry, seating herself in a chair by the window with her back very straight and her gloved hands folded upon her knee, as though she had dressed for the interview as carefully as she might have dressed for church. You will forgive me, Monsieur Poirot, if I do not perform grief for your benefit. My husband and I understood one another very well, and neither of us pretended to a devotion we did not feel. I dare say half the county knew as much already. I have no wish for performance, madame, only for truth, which is a rarer commodity and considerably more useful to me. Poirot regarded her steadily. You will not mind, then, if I ask directly, did you wish your husband dead? A faint, cold smile. I wished, Monsieur Poirot, to be free of a marriage that had become a business arrangement, conducted under one roof. Whether that amounts to wishing him dead, I leave to your own judgment. I will say only that his death does not distress me as convention would demand, and that I see no profit in pretending otherwise to a man who would in any case see through the pretence. You are candid, madame. It is refreshing, if occasionally alarming. Poirot inclined his head. Tell me of the new will your husband spoke of at dinner last night. Do you know its contents? For the first time, something like genuine uncertainty crossed Lady Diana's composed features. I do not. He mentioned it to unsettle the table. That was his habit, to remind us all that our comfort depended entirely upon his continued goodwill. He had made and remade that will, perhaps 4 times in as many years, each time favouring a different member of this household according to his mood. I had ceased, some time ago, to concern myself with its provisions, since I could not in any case predict them. And yet, said Poirot gently, a woman married to her husband's fortune more than to her husband himself might reasonably wish to know, before he died, whether that fortune would in fact come to her. You are suggesting a motive, Monsieur Poirot. I am suggesting only that I must consider every possibility, madame, as you would expect of me. Tell me, where were you between 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock this morning? In my bed, asleep, as I have already told the inspector, and as I have no witness to confirm beyond my own word, since my husband and I have kept separate rooms these 3 years past. She met his eyes without flinching. I did not kill him, Monsieur Poirot, though I confess I shall not mourn him with any great sincerity. But I did not kill him. One more question, madame, if you will permit it. Do you know of any correspondent of your husband's whose name, or whose signature, begins with the letter E? Something passed across Lady Diana's face then, swift, controlled, but unmistakable to eyes as practised as Poirot's. I cannot think of anyone in particular, she said, and rose, gathering her gloves. If that is all, Monsieur Poirot, I find this morning has been trying enough without prolonging it. She left with the same composed step with which she had entered. and Poirot watched her go with an expression Hastings had learned, over many cases, to recognize as something between satisfaction and regret. "She's lying," Hastings said, once the door had closed. "She is concealing something, which is not quite the same thing as lying, though it amounts, very often, to the same inconvenience for the person investigating a murder." Poirot tapped the arm of his chair thoughtfully. "But observe, Hastings, she did not ask me why I inquired after the letter E. A woman with nothing to hide, asked so curious a question, would surely wish to know its purpose. Lady Diana did not ask, because she already suspected the answer, and preferred not to hear it confirmed aloud." Chapter 8. A Question of Time. It was Evangeline Vane's interview, conducted an hour later, that yielded the first crack in the wall of careful reticence the household had thus far presented to Poirot's inquiries. She came into the morning-room already weeping, though whether from grief, fear, or simple exhaustion, Hastings could not have said, and would not, for some minutes, be persuaded to sit. "You needn't be gentle with me, Monsieur Poirot," she said at last, dropping into the chair opposite. "I know what you must think, that I'm the sort of silly girl who weeps prettily and tells you nothing, but I haven't slept, and I can't stop thinking that this is somehow my fault." "Why should it be your fault, mademoiselle?" "Because I quarrelled with my father, dreadfully, 3 days ago, and I haven't had the chance to make it right." She twisted a handkerchief between her fingers. "There is a man, Monsieur Poirot, in Brighton. His name is Edward Latimer, and he was, my father's most bitter enemy in business, though I did not know that when I first met him, and by the time I did, it was too late. I loved him already. My father discovered it a fortnight ago. He was incandescent. He said if I did not end it by Michaelmas, he would cut me out of his will entirely and see Edward ruined besides." Hastings felt Poirot go very still beside him. "And did you end it, mademoiselle, by Michaelmas, as your father demanded?" "I tried. I wrote to Edward and told him we must stop, that my father would destroy him if we did not, and he wrote back that he could not simply stop, that he loved me too much, and that if my father tried to ruin him, he would find some way to fight back." Evangeline's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "I burned his letter, Monsieur Poirot, the very night I received it, because I was afraid my father would find it and use it as further proof against Edward. But I kept the last one he sent, the one that came only yesterday, which I have not yet had the courage to burn." "The letter signed only with the initial E," said Poirot softly, "which I found in your father's desk, mademoiselle, not this morning's ashes." Evangeline went white. "He found it. He must have found it in my room and taken it, and, oh God, if he confronted Edward, if Edward came here. Did Mr. Latimer come to Ashcombe Priory last night?" "No, no, I swear it, Monsieur Poirot. He is in Brighton. He has been in Brighton all week. I had a telephone call from him only yesterday afternoon, and he told me so himself." She was weeping in earnest now. "But my father might have gone to him, or written to him, or I don't know what he might have done, only that he was so very angry, angrier than I had ever seen him, and I am so afraid that whatever happened last night has something to do with what I did." Poirot regarded her for a long moment with an expression of genuine, unhurried kindness. "Mademoiselle, I do not think your love affair killed your father, however much guilt you may wish to assume on its behalf. But I must ask you one further question, and I ask you to answer it with great care, for it may matter a great deal. At what hour, precisely, did your telephone call from Mr. Latimer take place yesterday?" "At 4 o'clock. I remember, because I had just come in from riding." "And is it possible," Poirot asked, very quietly, "that anyone else in this house was aware of that call, its hour, its content, or even that it took place at all?" Evangeline frowned through her tears, considering. "I suppose, yes. Simon was in the hall when I took it, on the extension in the passage. He might easily have overheard. He often teases me about Edward, has done for weeks. He knew of it before my father did, in fact. I told him myself, in confidence, and I believe now that it was Simon who told my father in the end, though he has never admitted as much to me. Poirot's eyes, upon hearing this, took on the particular brightness Hastings had learned to associate with a hunter who has, at last, sighted his quarry through the undergrowth. Chapter 9. The Colonel's Debt. Colonel Rupert Ashworth entered the morning room with the studied heartiness of a man determined to brazen his way through an unpleasant interview by sheer volume of good fellowship, and Poirot, who had encountered this particular strategy many times before, allowed him to talk for some minutes uninterrupted before beginning, with evident relish, to dismantle it. "Damned unpleasant business, all this," the Colonel said, settling himself with a creak of old leather chair and older bones. "Known Marcus 30 years, you know, since our army days. Good sort, really, underneath the bluster. Shocking thing to happen to a man in his own house." "You and Sir Marcus were close friends then, Colonel?" "As close as a man can be to another. He owes rather too much money, I suppose," said Ashworth, with a bark of laughter that did not disguise the sudden wariness in his eyes. "No use denying it, Poirot. You'll have heard already, I don't doubt, from that secretary of his, or some other tale-bearer in the servants' hall. I owe Marcus close on £3,000, borrowed against a run of bad luck at cards these 2 years past, and he'd begun, this last month, to speak of calling it in. That is a very great sum, Colonel, for a man to be pressed to repay upon short notice." "It would have ruined me," Ashworth said simply, the bluster draining from him all at once, leaving behind something older and more tired. "I'll not pretend otherwise, Poirot, since I don't doubt you'd see through the pretense in any case. If Marcus had called in that debt, I should have been obliged to sell the last of my land, and my wife is not a well woman, and the shock of it might have finished her entirely. I had hoped, this weekend, to persuade him to extend the term. He would not hear of it. Told me, last evening, that he intended to have his solicitor draw up formal notice on Monday. And so you had, Colonel, a very considerable motive to wish Sir Marcus dead before Monday came." Ashworth met Poirot's eyes steadily, and there was, Hastings thought, something almost like relief in the admission that followed. "I did. I'll not deny it, and I dare say you'd think me a fool to try. But I did not kill him, Poirot, and I can prove it, though the proof does me no credit at all. I was not asleep at 5 o'clock this morning. I was in the billiard room, drinking, having sat up half the night, unable to face my bed and the thoughts that waited there. Gill, the chauffeur, will confirm it. He came through at some point to bank the fire in the hall and found me there, still at it, past 4 o'clock. "And did you remain in the billiard room until the alarm was raised?" "I did. I heard the shot. Thought at first it was a poacher in the home wood. We've had trouble with them this autumn. And then, some minutes later, the commotion in the hall, and went up to see what the matter was." Ashworth's hands, Hastings noticed, had begun to shake, though whether from drink, fear, or simple grief he could not say. "I am ashamed of a great many things in my life, Poirot, chief among them the debt that brought me to this house this weekend, with murder, God help me, more than once in my thoughts. But I did not do it. Whatever else I am not that." Poirot regarded him for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested that he believed the Colonel entirely, or very nearly so. "I shall verify your account with Gill, Colonel, as I am sure you expect. But I will say this much. A man capable of confessing so damaging a motive without prompting is, in my experience, rarely the man who has also committed the murder that motive would explain. The guilty, Colonel, generally protect their secrets rather more jealously than you have protected yours." The Colonel seemed to sag with relief at this, though he mastered himself quickly, drawing himself up in the old military manner. "I'll tell you something else, Poirot, since we're being frank with one another. Marcus wasn't always the hard man you've heard described this weekend. When we served together, he was generous to a fault, gave half his pay away to men in worse trouble than himself, more than once. It was the money that changed him, I think, the making of it, and then the fear of losing it. A man builds an empire from nothing, as he did, and after a while he can't quite believe anyone else deserves a share of it, even the people he loves best. I don't excuse what he became, but I'd hate for you to think he was born a hard man. He wasn't. He earned it, the way some men earn a bad temper through disappointment, one disappointment at a time. That is, I think, a truer epitaph than any that will appear upon his headstone, Colonel, said Poirot gently, and I thank you for it. Grief expressed honestly is worth a great deal more to an investigation than grief performed for propriety's sake. Chapter 10. The Secretary's Secret. It was Gil the chauffeur, sought out by Hastings in the stable-yard, while Poirot rested, or, more accurately, sat in perfect stillness in the library chair, eyes closed, hands folded upon his waistcoat, in the attitude Hastings had long ago learned indicated furious mental activity rather than sleep, who confirmed Colonel Ashworth's account in every particular. He had indeed found the Colonel in the billiard-room shortly after 4, glass in hand, and had exchanged a few words with him about the lateness of the hour before returning to his own quarters above the garage. That accounts for the Colonel, Poirot said, when Hastings brought him the confirmation, without opening his eyes. Which leaves us, mon ami, with a rather smaller circle than we began with. Lady Diana, alone in her room, unwitnessed. Miss Hart, alone in hers, unwitnessed, until she came running at the shot. Monsieur Traherne, whose account of his own movements grows less credible with every fresh detail we uncover, and Dr. Rossiter, whom we have not yet properly examined at all. You think it's Traherne? I think, Hastings, that Monsieur Traherne had motive in abundance, an embezzlement of thousands of pounds, about to be exposed by an audit his uncle had commissioned in secret. A temper that would not survive discovery, since a man convicted of defrauding his own family firm faces prison as surely as any common thief. I think he had opportunity. He was dressed, and downstairs, well before the household woke, and I think his account of his own movements has shifted, subtly, at every telling, in the manner of a story constructed rather than remembered. But motive and opportunity are not proof, mon ami, and I have not yet asked Miss Hart the one question that may settle the matter beyond doubt. He found the secretary in Sir Marcus's study itself, where she had gone, with Inspector Japp's permission, to begin the melancholy business of sorting her late employer's correspondence. She looked up at Poirot's entrance with the wary, cornered expression of a woman who has been dreading, all morning, a conversation she cannot avoid. "Mademoiselle," said Poirot, without preamble, "I asked you this morning whether you were protecting someone, and you did not answer me. I ask you again now, and I ask you to consider very carefully before you refuse a second time, for I believe a man's liberty, perhaps his life, may depend upon your candour. Did Sir Marcus tell you, before he retired last night, what he intended to do with the results of the audit you prepared for him?" Miss Hart's hands, folded upon the desk, tightened until the knuckles showed white. "He told me," she said at last, very low, "that he intended to confront Mr. Traherne with the figures this very morning, before breakfast, and that if the discrepancy could not be satisfactorily explained, he would go to the police himself, this week, and see his own nephew prosecuted for theft. He said," her voice caught, "he said he did not care what scandal it brought upon the family name, that a thief was a thief, whatever blood he shared with the man he had robbed. And did Monsieur Traherne know this? That his uncle intended to confront him this very morning? I do not know for certain, but I believe he must have suspected something of the kind, for he came to my room last evening, past 10 o'clock, and asked me directly whether Sir Marcus had commissioned any special audit of the Rotterdam and Antwerp accounts. I told him I could not discuss my employer's private instructions, but I fear my very refusal to answer told him a great deal more than any answer would have done." She looked up at Poirot then, and there were tears in her eyes at last. "I am not protecting Mr. Traherne, Monsieur Poirot, if that is what you suspect. I am afraid of him. He has always had a temper beneath that pleasant manner of his, and last night, when I would not answer his question, he looked at me in a way that frightened me very much indeed." Chapter 11. The Doctor's Silence. Dr. Edmund Rossiter had, throughout the long morning of interviews, remained a quiet, peripheral figure. present at every gathering, watchful, professionally composed, and asked, thus far, only the routine questions of a medical witness. Poirot, however, had not forgotten him, and it was with a certain deliberate gentleness that he requested the doctor's presence in the library that afternoon. "You have known Sir Marcus how long, Doctor?" 25 years. I attended his first wife in her last illness, and have been physician to this household ever since. Rossiter's voice was low, measured, the voice of a man accustomed to delivering difficult truths to frightened patients. "I do not know what more I can tell you, Monsieur Poirot, that I have not already told the inspector. Perhaps nothing of the crime itself. But I am curious, Doctor, about a matter that has troubled me since this morning, the composure of this household. Everyone I have interviewed today has spoken to me of motive, of secrets, of fear, and yet each has done so only after considerable pressing, as though each believed themselves alone in possessing a reason to have wished Sir Marcus harm. I begin to wonder, Doctor, whether there is not some larger secret in this house, known to more than one person, which no one has yet chosen to share with me." Rossiter was silent a long moment, his grey eyes fixed upon the middle distance. "You are a perceptive man, Monsieur Poirot. Very well, I will tell you something I had hoped to keep private, since it reflects no credit upon the dead, and I have always believed a physician owes some loyalty even to a patient who is no longer living. Sir Marcus Vane was not, in the ordinary sense, a well man. I had been treating him these 6 months past for a heart condition of some severity, the sort of condition that a man in his position, dependent upon an appearance of vigour and control, does not wish widely known. I had warned him, not a fortnight ago, that any great shock or exertion might prove fatal. And did Sir Marcus's family know of this condition? Lady Diana knew. I had told her myself, some weeks past, believing she ought to be prepared. I do not know whether she shared the knowledge further." Rossiter's expression darkened slightly. "I will tell you also, Monsieur Poirot, since you have clearly begun to suspect it in any case, that Sir Marcus had spoken to me, only yesterday afternoon, of his intention to disinherit his nephew entirely, upon discovery of what he called a betrayal I shall not forgive, and to alter his will once more in consequence, a fourth revision in as many years, as I understand Lady Diana has already told you. He asked me, in fact, to witness the new document this very weekend, though he had not yet had it drawn up in final form when he died. Do you know its intended provisions? Only in outline. Sir Marcus told me he intended to leave the bulk of the shipping firm to Miss Evangeline, provided her attachment to Mr. Latimer was ended, and a considerable legacy to Miss Hart, in recognition, his words, of 11 years' faithful service he did not believe he had adequately rewarded. Simon Traherne was to receive nothing beyond a token sum, and a formal notice, to be delivered upon Sir Marcus's death, that the matter of the missing funds would be pursued through the courts, regardless of any grief the family might feel at seeing him prosecuted. Hastings, listening, felt the shape of the case shift and settle, like a key turning at last in a stiff lock. Then Traherne stood to lose everything, his inheritance, his position, his liberty, the moment that will was signed. "Precisely, Hastings. And I think," said Poirot slowly, "that Monsieur Traherne knew, or strongly suspected, that his uncle intended some such revision, and that he could not afford to wait and discover its final terms. A man cornered by ruin does not always wait for the trap to close fully before he strikes at the hand that built it." He turned back to Rossiter. "One further question, Doctor, and I ask it in the strictest confidence. Sir Marcus's heart condition, is it the sort that might, under great emotional strain, produce a death that could be mistaken, superficially, for something other than its true cause?" Rossiter frowned. "I do not follow you, Monsieur Poirot. The cause of death here is not in doubt. A bullet, fired at close range. There is no question of natural causes." "No," Poirot agreed, with a small, private smile that Hastings had learned to distrust profoundly. "There is no question of that at all. I ask only because I wish to be certain, Doctor, that you yourself had considered every possibility. As I confess, I have not yet finished considering them myself." He rose and made as if to leave, then paused at the library door, as though a further thought had only just occurred to him. "One matter more, doctor, and then I shall trouble you no further today. The sleeping draught you prescribed for Sir Marcus, of what strength and in what dosage was it ordinarily to be taken?" "A moderate dose, Monsieur Poirot, 10 grains of chloral, dissolved in water, taken at bedtime, when his heart condition made rest difficult. I was careful to prescribe conservatively, given his age and his heart. A larger dose, taken all at once by a man of his years and constitution, would produce a sleep from which he might not easily be roused, and given the fragility of his heart, might in certain circumstances prove dangerous in itself, quite apart from anything else that befell him. And who, besides yourself, would know both the location of that draught and the ordinary strength of the dose?" Rossiter considered. "Lady Diana, certainly, since I informed her of his condition. Miss Hart, very probably, as she manages his household accounts, including, I believe, his chemist's bills. And I imagine any member of the family who troubled to ask a servant where the master kept his night medicines would learn the answer readily enough. It has never been treated as any great secret in this house, Monsieur Poirot, merely as the ordinary business of an aging man's health." "Thank you, doctor. You have been, as ever, most precise and most helpful." Poirot's smile, as he left the library, was that of a man who has just heard confirmed a fact he had already, privately, concluded to be true. Chapter 12. Evangeline's Confession. That evening, after a dinner eaten in near total silence, Evangeline Vane sought Poirot out privately in the library. Her earlier tears dried into something harder and more resolved. "I have not told you everything, Monsieur Poirot," she said, closing the door behind her, with the particular care of a woman ensuring she will not be overheard. "I was ashamed to say it before, in front of Hastings, in front of anyone. But I think you must know it, if you are to find out who killed my father." "I am listening, mademoiselle. Simon came to my room last night, very late, past midnight, I think, though I cannot be certain of the hour. He was in a state I had never seen before, pale, shaking, quite unlike his usual manner. He told me my father had confronted him, after everyone else had retired, with proof of the missing money, and that he did not know what he was going to do." She twisted her hands together. "He asked me, and I did not understand then, why he should ask such a thing, whether my father took any medicine before bed, and whether I knew where it was kept." Poirot went very still. "And did you tell him?" "I told him my father took a sleeping draught most nights, prescribed by Dr. Rossiter, kept in a cabinet in his dressing-room. I thought nothing of it at the time. I assumed he meant to slip something into it, to make my father sleep more deeply and give himself time to think, or perhaps to search the study for proof of what he'd done before my father could act. I did not think," her voice broke, "I did not think he meant to kill him, Monsieur Poirot. I swear to you I did not think that. Did your father in fact take the sleeping draught last night, do you know?" "I do not know. I did not see him again after dinner." Poirot rose and paced the length of the library, once, twice, his brow furrowed in the particular manner Hastings recognized as the final assembly of some intricate mental structure. "Mademoiselle, I must ask you one further question, and I beg you to answer with absolute precision, for a great deal depends upon it. You told me this morning that Simon Traherne was in the passage when you took your telephone call from Mr. Latimer yesterday afternoon at 4 o'clock. I ask you now, did Simon Traherne, at any point yesterday or last night, ask you about the household's routine, about who slept where, who might wake at what hour, how sound carries through this house at night?" Evangeline frowned, considering. "He did ask me, now that you mention it, at dinner, before my father's little speech about the will, whether Miss Hart's room was near enough to the study to hear anything unusual in the night. I thought it an odd question at the time, but I did not think of it again until this moment." "Thank you, mademoiselle," said Poirot softly. "You have given me, I think, the very last piece I required." Chapter 13. The Herring That Swam Away. Inspector Japp, summoned to the library the following morning to review the case's progress, listened to Poirot's account of the previous day's interviews with the expression of a man watching a complicated conjuring trick and waiting, with some impatience, for the rabbit to appear. So Ashworth's cleared by the chauffeur. Lady Diana's got no alibi, but no clear opportunity either, since she never left her room, that we can prove. The daughter's soppy love affair looks more like a sideshow than the main event, and the doctor's given us a motive for Traherne, roughly the size of Kent. Japp counted the points off on thick fingers. That leaves Traherne holding most of the cards, and a fair few of them marked. Why haven't we arrested him already, Poirot? Embezzlement, a disinheritance about to be signed, dressed and downstairs at an hour he can't properly account for, and now this business of asking after sleeping draughts and who might overhear what in the night. Sounds like a man planning a murder to me. It sounds like a man planning a murder, Inspector, because that is precisely what it is meant to sound like. Poirot held up a cautioning hand. But consider, mon ami, a man clever enough to embezzle thousands of pounds from 3 separate shipping accounts over the better part of a year, without his own uncle discovering it until an audit was specially commissioned to find it, is not a stupid man. Would such a man commit murder in a manner so careless as to leave a trail of suspicious questions the very evening before, asked openly of his own cousin, in a house full of witnesses? Japp scowled. Criminals aren't always clever about the crime itself, even when they're clever about everything else. Panic does odd things to a man's judgment. That is true, and I do not dismiss it. But there is a difficulty of timing that troubles me a great deal more than Monsieur Traherne's carelessness of manner. Poirot rose and crossed to the window, looking out over the grey gardens with his hands clasped behind his back. The exchange records you obtained yesterday afternoon, Inspector. They show, I believe, the precise moment at which the telephone call to the police was placed. 5:19 and 40 seconds, near enough. Japp consulted his notebook. Traherne said he found the body and telephoned at once, immediately, his word. Call went through at 19 minutes past 5. Fits well enough with the study clock, which you tell me stood at 17 minutes past when you yourself arrived a few minutes after the alarm was raised. It fits very well indeed, Poirot agreed. Almost, one might say, too well. Consider, Inspector. Miss Hart tells us she woke at the sound of the shot and reached the study within a minute or two. She places Monsieur Traherne's arrival some 30 seconds after her own. If the shot was fired, as Dr. Rossiter's examination suggests, at approximately 5 o'clock or a very few minutes after, and Monsieur Traherne reached the study within perhaps 90 seconds of that shot, and the call to the police was placed at 19 minutes past 5, what, then, was Monsieur Traherne doing for the better part of 15 minutes between his arrival at the body and his telephone call reporting it? Japp's scowl deepened into something more thoughtful. Might have been shock, standing there staring at the body a good while before his wits came back to him. He might, but a man in shock, when he does at last telephone, speaks, as I remarked to you myself, on the very morning of the murder, in the broken, repetitive sentences of genuine distress, not in the smooth, complete constructions I overheard from the passage. No, Inspector. I think those 15 minutes were spent in some other occupation entirely, an occupation that required calm, not shock, and that I have not yet fully determined, though I begin to have a very strong suspicion of its nature. Poirot turned from the window. I should like, before we go further, to examine Monsieur Traherne's bedroom and Sir Marcus's dressing room, and I should like Dr. Rossiter present when we do so. Chapter 14. The Telephone Exchange. The search of Simon Traherne's bedroom yielded, at first, nothing of apparent significance. A wardrobe of unremarkable clothes, a writing desk cluttered with business correspondence, a half-finished letter to a firm of Rotterdam agents that Poirot read through twice with close attention before setting aside. It was Dr. Rossiter, examining the young man's washstand at Poirot's request, who made the discovery that changed the shape of the case entirely. "There's a faint smell here," Rossiter said, frowning over the porcelain basin, beneath the ordinary soap and water, something medicinal, Chloral, I think, or something very like it. He lifted a small glass vial, empty, tucked behind the water jug, where a careless hand might easily overlook it. This is one of my own prescription bottles, Monsieur Poirot. I recognize the chemist's label. It was prescribed for Sir Marcus's sleeping draught, and should by rights be in his own dressing room, not hidden in his nephew's washstand. And is it empty, doctor? Quite empty. If this held the full prescribed dose, and someone administered it to a man already accustomed to a smaller nightly measure, the effect would be a sleep very deep indeed. Deep enough, I should think, that a man might be roused only with considerable difficulty, if at all, by an ordinary disturbance. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Then let us reconsider the sequence of that morning's events, mon ami, with this discovery in mind. Suppose Monsieur Traherne did not, in a moment of panicked violence, shoot his uncle at 5 o'clock this morning, as we have been assuming. Suppose instead that he administered a heavy dose of Sir Marcus's own sleeping draught to him at some earlier hour, perhaps in a nightcap, offered under the guise of reconciliation after their quarrel, and that Sir Marcus, deeply asleep, was shot, not in a moment of confrontation, but while entirely unconscious, sometime well before 5 o'clock. Suppose further that Monsieur Traherne then waited, in the study or nearby, watching the clock, until precisely the hour he had determined to be most advantageous, before creating the appearance of just having discovered the body, opening the window for effect, disturbing the ashes in the grate, to be certain his own burned correspondence with the Rotterdam agents left no trace, and only then raising the alarm and telephoning the police. But the shot, Japp objected. Someone would have heard a shot fired well before 5, surely, same as they heard the one that woke half the house. Would they? Poirot's smile was thin. Unless, Inspector, the true shot was fired considerably earlier, in the small hours when the household slept most soundly, and disguised, perhaps by the report of a car engine in the drive, or some other covering noise, of which I have not yet determined the nature, while what the household heard at 5 o'clock, and what genuinely woke Miss Hart from her sleep, was some second sound entirely. A door slammed with unusual force, perhaps, or a book, dropped deliberately upon a hard floor, timed with precision to coincide with the moment Monsieur Traherne wished his uncle's death discovered. Japp stared at him. You're telling me the shot we all assumed woke the house wasn't the shot that killed him at all? I am telling you, Inspector, that I believe the true time of death may be a good deal earlier than any of us has yet supposed, and that the entire elaborate architecture of that morning's discovery, the telephone call included, was constructed by a man who understood, better than anyone in this house, that the first person to report a murder is very often the last person the police think to suspect of having committed it. It is a most effective disguise, Inspector, to call the police yourself, in tones of shock and haste, and thereby place yourself, in the minds of all who hear you, upon the side of the innocent rather than the guilty. Chapter 15. The Weight of a Glove. Dr. Rossiter's second examination of the body, conducted that afternoon with rather more thoroughness than the hurried assessment of the murder morning had allowed, confirmed what Poirot had by now come to suspect. I was too quick, before, in placing the time of death so precisely, the doctor admitted, with the discomfort of a professional man confessing an oversight. The signs I noted as consistent with a death 20 minutes prior were consistent also, on closer reflection, with a death considerably earlier, 2 hours earlier, perhaps 3, given the temperature of the room and the state of the blood. I ought to have allowed for a wider margin, and I did not, because everyone in the house was so certain the shot they heard at 5 o'clock was the shot that killed him. I see now I allowed the assumption to shape my judgment, rather than the reverse. It is a very natural error, Doctor, and I do not think you should reproach yourself for it. A physician examines the body he is shown, in the circumstances he is told to expect. The deception was constructed precisely to produce that expectation. Poirot turned to Japp. I should like now, Inspector, to examine Monsieur Traherne's outer garments, his shooting jacket in particular, and any gloves he may have brought for the weekend's sport. The gloves, when found, told their own story, with an eloquence no witness had yet matched. A pair of stout leather shooting gloves, their right-hand palm and fingers marked with a faint, dark discoloration that Dr. Rossiter, examining them beneath the library lamp, pronounced without hesitation to be the residue of discharged gunpowder. A man does not ordinarily wear gloves to shoot a revolver at close range within a warm room, Poirot observed. He wears gloves for precisely one reason in such circumstances, to ensure that no fingerprint of his own is left upon the weapon, while relying upon the victim's own hand, pressed afterward to the grip while still warm and pliant, to supply the fingerprints that will satisfy a coroner's inquest that the dead man held the gun himself. That's premeditation, and no mistake, said Japp grimly. Man doesn't bring gloves prepared for gunshot residue by accident. No, Inspector, he does not. And there is one further matter I wish to settle before we proceed further. The covering noise Monsieur Traherne must have arranged to disguise the true shot fired in the small hours from the sound the household believed woke them at 5 o'clock. Poirot turned to Hastings. You will recall, mon ami, that Gil the chauffeur told us he was abroad in the house past 4 o'clock, banking the fire in the hall, and encountered Colonel Ashworth in the billiard room at that hour. I should like to ask Gil one further question. Whether, at any point in the small hours, he heard the sound of a motor engine in the drive, or any other sudden, sharp noise that might have been mistaken, by a sleeping household, for nothing more than the ordinary settling of an old house at night. Gil, sought out once more in the stable-yard, confirmed it readily enough, once the question was put to him directly. Now that you mention it, sir, I did hear something, round about 3:30, I should think, though I didn't think much of it at the time, a sort of sharp crack, like a branch snapping, or a door caught by a draught and slammed hard. I was in the boot-room at the time, saw nothing, and thought no more of it till this moment. 3:30, Poirot repeated softly. That, I think, mon ami, is the hour at which Sir Marcus Vane truly died, shot while deeply asleep, beneath the influence of a sleeping draught meant for a smaller dose, in a study to which his nephew had lured him, or which his nephew had entered after he retired, on some pretext of continuing their earlier quarrel to a peaceable conclusion. And I think that Monsieur Traherne then withdrew, composed himself, disposed of incriminating correspondence in the study fire, and waited, with what nerve, mon ami, what dreadful, patient nerve, for nearly 2 hours, until precisely the moment he judged best, before manufacturing the sound that would summon the household, and the telephone call that would place him, in all our minds, upon the side of the shocked and grieving rather than the guilty. Chapter 16. The Trap at Ashcombe. That evening, at Poirot's request, the entire household assembled once more in the great hall of Ashcombe Priory. Lady Diana, in her habitual black, composed and watchful, Evangeline, pale and red-eyed, seated close by Miss Hart, who had become, in the space of 2 days, something of a protector to the younger woman, Colonel Ashworth, sober for once, his ruddy face drawn with the strain of the preceding days, Dr. Rossiter, grave and silent by the mantelpiece, and Simon Traherne, seated a little apart from the others, his composure, Hastings noted with a chill, as perfect and unshaken as it had been from the very first moment of the tragedy's discovery. Inspector Japp stood by the door, 2 constables discreetly positioned behind him, and Poirot took his place before the cold hearth with the particular theatrical stillness Hastings had come, over many cases, to recognize as the prelude to revelation. Outside, the light was failing early, as it does in late October, and someone, Miss Hart, Hastings thought, ever attentive to the small comforts of a household even in its darkest hour, had ordered the lamps lit rather earlier than usual, so that the great hall glowed with a warm, steady light, quite at odds with the coldness of the business about to be transacted within it. Lady Diana had chosen a chair a little apart from the others, as was her habit. Evangeline sat close against Miss Hart's shoulder, her hand gripped tightly in the older woman's own. The two of them united now, Hastings thought, by something more than mere proximity of misfortune. Colonel Ashworth stood rather than sat, his broad frame planted before the empty fireplace, as though he might, by sheer physical presence, ward off whatever was to come. Only Simon Traherne seemed entirely at his ease, seated with one leg crossed over the other, his expression one of mild, patient curiosity, as though he expected to be entertained rather than accused. "I have asked you all to gather here this evening," Poirot began, "because I believe I can now tell you, with complete confidence, exactly what happened to Sir Marcus Vane, and exactly who is responsible for his death. I ask your patience while I set out the matter in full, for the truth, as is so often the case, is considerably stranger and more carefully constructed than the simple picture we were all, at first, invited to believe." He recounted, with methodical precision, the discoveries of the preceding 2 days. The cigarette smoked to its end in a room where cigarettes were forbidden, the ashes disturbed in the grate, the window opened without a mark left upon sill or ivy to suggest genuine entry or escape, the letter signed only with the initial E, and Evangeline's tearful confession of her love affair, offered and then set gently aside as the sideshow it had, in the end, proved to be Colonel Ashworth's debt, confessed freely and confirmed in its alibi by the chauffeur Gill, the missing thousands from the Rotterdam and Antwerp accounts, the new will that would have disinherited and disgraced its author's own nephew, and finally, the discrepancy of timing that had first troubled him, the 15 minutes unaccounted for between Simon Traherne's supposed discovery of the body and his call to the police. "It was the telephone exchange records," Poirot continued, "that first suggested to me the true shape of this crime. A man in genuine shock, telephoning to report a murder he has that instant discovered, does not speak in sentences of perfect, rehearsed composure, and yet that is precisely how Monsieur Traherne spoke, within minutes of his supposed discovery. I began to ask myself, what manner of man rehearses, in advance, the very words with which he will report a crime as though he had only just stumbled upon it? Simon Traherne's face had gone very white, but he said nothing, his eyes fixed upon Poirot with the wary stillness of a cornered animal calculating its chances. "The answer, of course," Poirot said, "is a man who has planned the crime with such care that he has also planned its discovery, down to the very words with which he will summon the police. A man who understood, better than any other person in this house, one simple and devastating truth, that the person who telephones the police to report a murder is, in the minds of those who hear that call, almost never suspected of having committed it. We assume, quite naturally, that the alarmed voice on the telephone belongs to a witness, not a murderer. It is, Monsieur Traherne, the perfect disguise, and you very nearly wore it successfully." Chapter 17. The First to Call. For a long moment, Simon Traherne said nothing at all, and the silence in the great hall stretched taut as a wire. Then, quite suddenly, something in his careful composure gave way, not dramatically, but quietly, like a wall long undermined finally settling into collapse. "You cannot prove any of this," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier steadiness. "A theory, Monsieur Poirot, however cleverly constructed, is not evidence. On the contrary, Monsieur Traherne, I have a very great deal of evidence, and I shall lay it before you now, in full." Poirot's voice remained gentle, almost regretful. "Your shooting gloves, found among your effects, bear the residue of discharged gunpowder upon the right palm and fingers, residue no innocent man requires, since no innocent man wears gloves to fire a revolver at close range within a warm room, except to ensure that his own fingerprints are absent from the weapon, and that his uncle's hand, pressed to the grip while still warm, supplies the prints a coroner will expect to find. An empty vial of Dr. Rossiter's prescribed sleeping draught, taken from Sir Marcus's own dressing room, was found concealed in your washstand. The draught, I believe, that you administered to your uncle in a nightcap of reconciliation after your quarrel, to ensure he slept deeply enough that the true hour of his death, some time before 3:30 this morning, would pass unheard by the household. Gil the chauffeur heard the true shot at that hour and mistook it, as you intended anyone who heard it to mistake it, for nothing more than a door slammed by a draft. And the telephone exchange records show a gap of some 15 minutes between the moment Dr. Rossiter's revised examination suggests you must actually have reached the study, considerably earlier than 5 o'clock, and the moment you telephoned the police, a gap you spent, I believe, disposing of your own correspondence with the Rotterdam agents in the study fire, and composing yourself, and the room, and the story you intended to tell. "You cannot know I administered any draft," Simon said, though the fight had gone out of his voice entirely now. "You cannot know I was in that room before 5 o'clock at all. I know it, Monsieur Traherne, because a man innocent of murder does not ask his cousin, the evening before, whether Miss Hart's room lies near enough to the study to overhear a disturbance in the night. A question that serves no purpose whatever, except to a man planning precisely such a disturbance, time to be heard by precisely the witness he intends should discover the body soon after himself. And I know it because your uncle had commissioned, in the strictest secrecy, an audit of the very accounts you controlled, and intended, this very morning, to expose you before this household as a thief, and this very week, to see you prosecuted and disgraced, regardless of the shame it brought upon his own name. You did not kill your uncle in a moment of panic, Monsieur Traherne. You killed him with the same cold, careful calculation you had applied, for the better part of a year, to concealing the theft that drove you to it. And you very nearly succeeded in convincing an entire household, and a very capable Scotland Yard inspector besides, that the man who raised the alarm could not possibly be the man who caused it." Simon Traherne's shoulders sagged, and for a moment Hastings thought he might collapse entirely into the chair behind him. When he spoke again, his voice was flat, stripped at last of all performance. "He was going to destroy me," he said. "Prison, disgrace, the family name dragged through every newspaper in London. And for what? Money I meant to replace. Money the firm would never even have missed, if only he had not commissioned that wretched audit. I did not plan it, at first. I swear that much is true. But when I understood, last night, exactly what he intended, I understood also that there was only one way to prevent it, and once I had understood that, the rest was simply a matter of arranging the details correctly." He looked up, and something almost like relief moved across his exhausted face. "I telephoned the police myself, you know, because I could not think what else an innocent man would do, and I thought, I truly believed, that a murderer would never think to call the very people sent to catch him. It seemed at the time the safest thing in the world to do." "It is, Monsieur Traherne," said Poirot quietly, "a very old and very human error, to believe that boldness and innocence must always resemble one another. Inspector Japp, I believe you have your man." For a moment, before Japp could complete the formal caution, Lady Diana rose from her chair, and Hastings thought she might weep at last, however briefly, for a household so thoroughly shattered, but she did not weep. She crossed instead to where Simon sat and looked down at him with an expression of cold, unmasked contempt that seemed to strip away, in that single instant, whatever remained of his composure. "You let us all sit in this house for 2 days," she said, very quietly, "watching each of us suspect one another, watching Evangeline weep herself sick over a love affair you knew was nothing to do with any of it, watching poor Ashworth confess a debt that shamed him before a room full of strangers, all so that no one would look twice at you. I do not think, Simon, that I shall ever forgive you that, whatever else I might, in time, forgive." Simon said nothing. He did not look at her, nor at Evangeline, whose quiet weeping had begun again at her cousin's shoulder, nor at Miss Hart, who watched him with an expression Hastings could not quite read, something that might, in another circumstance, have been pity. Inspector Japp stepped forward, and the words of arrest, spoken in his flat, official voice, fell into the silence of the great hall like stones into still water. Simon Traherne did not resist. He rose, straightened his jacket with something of his old composed manner, and walked between the two constables toward the door without once looking back at the assembled household he had, until 2 days before, called his family. Only at the threshold did he pause, and turn, and address Poirot directly, in a voice from which every trace of his earlier smoothness had at last entirely fallen away. "Tell me one thing, Monsieur Poirot, since I do not suppose I shall have the chance to ask you again. If I had not telephoned the police myself, if I had simply gone back to bed and let someone else discover him and raise the alarm in their own time, in their own words, would you have suspected me so quickly?" Poirot considered the question with evident seriousness, as though it deserved, even now, an honest answer rather than a comforting one. "Perhaps not so quickly, monsieur. The gloves, the vial, the ashes in the grate, these I should have found regardless, in time, for the little grey cells do not require haste, only patience. But you are right that your own telephone call was, in the end, the single detail that first drew my attention to you above all others, precisely because it was constructed with such unnatural perfection. You built, monsieur, the very trap that caught you, brick by careful brick, in your determination to appear innocent. And it is a great and terrible irony, is it not, that the man who telephones the police first, believing himself thereby placed beyond suspicion, so often achieves nothing more than placing himself first in the queue of those the police, and men like myself, examine most closely of all." Simon Traherne said nothing further. He turned and walked out into the gathering dark between his two constables, and the great door of Ashcombe Priory closed behind him with a soft, final sound that seemed, to Hastings, considerably louder than the single shot that had first summoned them all from their beds 2 mornings before. Chapter 18. The Grey Cells at Rest. The house party dispersed the following morning in the subdued, hurried manner of guests, eager to leave behind a place that had briefly, unwillingly, become notorious. Hastings and Poirot took a later train, having stayed to complete certain formalities with Inspector Japp, and found themselves at last alone in a first-class carriage rattling gently back toward London through a countryside gilded, once more, with the same pewter autumn light that had greeted them upon their arrival. "A melancholy business," Hastings said, watching the fields slide past the window. "I confess I did not expect, when we came down for the shooting, to find quite so much tragedy waiting for us instead. Tragedy is rarely announced in advance, mon ami. That is precisely what makes it tragedy, and not merely misfortune anticipated." Poirot settled himself more comfortably against the cushions, his hands folded upon the head of his walking stick. "But I confess this case has interested me a very great deal, for it illustrates a truth I have observed many times in the course of my work, and yet which continues, each time, to strike me afresh, that the human mind is inclined, by a kind of instinct too deep for reason to correct, to trust the alarmed voice over the silent one. We hear a man cry out in shock, and we place him, without thinking, upon the side of the innocent, simply because we cannot easily imagine a murderer choosing, of his own accord, to summon the very authorities sent to hunt him down. And yet that's exactly what Traherne did. Precisely, mon ami, and it very nearly worked, because it exploits something true about ordinary human behavior and turns that truth into a weapon. Most men, discovering a murder, are indeed too shaken to speak with composure, and so we come to expect disorder as the mark of innocence and calm as the mark of guilt, reasoned about after the fact. Monsieur Traherne understood this instinct in others better than he understood the danger of relying upon it too heavily himself, for it was, in the end, precisely his over-perfect composure, his rehearsed and flawless account, that first roused my suspicion, long before I had gathered a single piece of physical evidence against him. The little grey cells, Hastings, are not deceived by outward calm or outward panic. They ask only, does this behavior fit the truth of what a frightened, innocent man would naturally do? And when the answer is no, when a man's account is too smooth, too complete, too perfectly rehearsed for the shock it claims to represent, then the grey cells begin, quietly, to look elsewhere for the truth. Hastings was silent a moment, turning the case over in his mind. What will happen to the rest of them? Lady Diana, the girl, poor old Ashworth. Lady Diana will inherit a fortune she never particularly loved the man who built it, and will, I think, find that fortune considerably less consoling than she perhaps expects. Mademoiselle Evangeline will, I hope, find in Monsieur Latimer a partner rather better than the tragedy of these 2 days might suggest, once she has recovered from the shock of learning how nearly her own confidences were turned to murderous use. Colonel Ashworth's debt, I understand, dies with its creditor, since Sir Marcus's estate passes now to heirs with rather less appetite for calling in old scores than the man himself possessed. And Miss Hart, I think, will find that the small legacy Sir Marcus intended for her, though it will likely be delayed some months by the proving of a will drawn up but never finally signed, will in the end provide her a measure of independence she has earned many times over through 11 years of loyal and difficult service. And Traherne, Monsieur Traherne, said Poirot, and for a moment something almost like sorrow crossed his face, will face the gallows, or a very long term of imprisonment if the jury is merciful, for a crime born not of wickedness in its origin, mon ami, but of a small dishonesty allowed to grow, unchecked, until it became a debt that could be settled, in his own desperate reckoning, only in blood. That is the lesson of this case, if it has one, that the little compromises a man makes with his own conscience, the small sums quietly diverted, the small lies quietly told, do not remain small. They grow, in the dark, like anything left untended, until one morning a man wakes to find that the only way out of the trap he built for himself is a door marked murder, and even then, Hastings, even at the very end, he could not resist the final vanity of believing himself clever enough to call the police himself and be believed. The train rattled on toward London, and Poirot, with the air of a man who had settled a troublesome account to his own complete satisfaction, closed his eyes and for the remainder of the journey said nothing more at all. The end.